Okay, a number of you have asked for this, and I want to put a little bit of time into this. This is a big video, but it's in 5 parts, and all the not all the parts are new. He reads a chapter from 12 Rules in one of them, but I just finished a video on kind of my Monday vlog where I look at some of the Jordan Peterson stuff that came out last week or over the weekend. And I highlighted some of Ron Dart's work on this and some of Ron Dart's explanation. And I think some of his explanation is some of the best out there. So let's take a little look at this and see what happens.
Today I want to present to you some of the things I've been thinking and writing about as Easter approached. I'm going to do this in 5 separate parts, which hopefully will make up a coherent whole. I'm going to read all of this because it's complicated.
Now, I love people, and I remember watching Candid Camera because when I was a kid, because people are just so much fun. When he said I read this, I just had to laugh because all of the Neil Postman stuff just flooded into my head, and all of my own journey about making these videos, or how do I make these videos? Do I read things in them, or do I speak this way? And one of the things that I've really been working through is the difference between the written word and the spoken word. And obviously the read word is kind of an amalgam of the two. We can be even more careful with our language when we write it down and then read it. And I'm just thinking of all the different layers here. So we have this on YouTube, and what's so interesting about Peterson is that he is, and a number of people have noted, he's a charismatic guy. He's fun to watch, and I think the biblical lectures are so much fun because he is so himself, and he just comes through the videos, and we just enjoy watching him. That's why I always think about the Truman Show, because we're watching him. But now he's going to read this, and I listened to the whole audiobook of 12 Rules for Life and really enjoyed it, and really enjoyed the fact that Peterson read it. And I know some people, I'll say it this way, some people get immature if you break down in public. And personally, I don't think one of the knocks I hear people give Peterson is, well, it's toxic masculinity. And it's like, okay, tell me how you define that. Well, men have to be, this certain way. Well, this guy regularly breaks down in public. Please tell me how he's a poster boy for toxic masculinity. So I love how genuine the guy is. I really do. And people have asked me about the conversation I had with him last week. And, well, what was he like? Well, you saw how he was like. We had a great time talking. And, I can see how he'd be as Scott Alexander noted, I can see how the guy's a terrific teacher and a terrific therapist, because he's very genuine, and in order to be genuine like this, you have to be secure, and none of us are as secure as we could be, or maybe even as secure as we'd want to be. But there's a real solidity to this guy, because to live what he's had to live for the last 2 years, with both the great opportunities that he's received, but also the attacks and the criticism that he's had to weather, it's a big deal. That's a big deal. There are days that even my little project, my little 5,000 YouTube subscribers, there you go, folks, part of a little tribe. It's a big tribe compared to my little church, but still, this is a big thing that he's on. And so he's going to read this, and I completely understand why. He wants to speak carefully, and he's dealing with something that's difficult. And again, if you go back to Ron Dart's video that I mentioned in my Monday vlog, which I'll post before I post this, probably not too much before I post this, but if you want to evaluate Peterson, the fairest way to evaluate him is within the framework that he's attempting to operate. not the framework that you are bringing to it. And that's why I talked again this morning about the filters. If your evaluative method of Peterson is limited to your filter, well, you're not really telling us anything about Peterson. You're just showing us your filter. And okay, you've got a filter. We've all got a filter. And some filters are easier to pick out than others. Some filters are more common than others. But I think people sometimes talk about the way I do these videos or why I do these videos. I'm high in openness. I don't want him to stop at my filters, because it's only when he gets past my filters that I can learn something about it. Now, obviously, there's danger in that in terms of a personality, because the things you let past your filters get into you, and so you run the risk of letting that other person impact you, and that's where. Okay, how secure are you? Are you fairly well established? Can you can you integrate and not lose yourself? You get this long prolegomena on top of the Easter video. We should be looking at this. Okay, here we go.
Part 1, the nature of experience. There are two ways of looking at the world: as a place of things and as a forum for action.
And again, if you're familiar with Peterson, this is a big deal, because he right away is kind of saying, here's the divide, baby. You got Sam Harris and all these think people over there, and here's me on the other side. And depending on where you go, right out of the gate is going to determine what everything's going to look like. And now he's going to make his argument for the forum for action.
Because we are living beings and must make our way pragmatically in the world, the second way of looking has to take precedence. This means that the world as a place of things is nested inside the world as a forum for action. This means that our conceptualization of the world as objective must remain subordinate to our conceptualization of the world as a place of being.
Okay, I want to pause there because I want to pull up this slide that I've used in a number of my videos. This is what he's talking about. He's talking about this is the materialist, what he calls Newtonian world, where we see objects, and now he's saying the world is a forum for being, a forum for action. You have your hierarchies, story governs stuff. We see tools. This is being and knowing. Okay, let's get back here to him.
This is from the first part of my book, Maps of Meaning. Quote, "The world can be validly construed as forum for action or place of things. The former manner of interpretation, more primordial and less clearly understood, finds its expression in the arts or humanities, in ritual, drama, literature, and mythology. The world as forum for action is a place of value, a place where all things have meaning. This meaning, which is shaped as a consequence of social interaction, is implication for action, or, at a higher level of analysis, implication for the configuration of the interpretive schema that produces or guides action. The latter manner of interpretation, the world as place of things."
Now, before he goes into place of things, again, this is manner of action or guide for action. This is his argument that you might say, oh, you have a field in front of you, but the field does not say how to go through the field. And this is, in a sense, the junction between, again, his Newtonian and his Darwinian, his pragmatism versus the naturalism that he's encountering and dealing with out there. And now on to the other side. And now again, he's not trying to say one or, he's trying to say both and, but they're nested. And he's saying you have to understand how it's nested.
finds its formal expression in the methods and theories of science. Science allows for increasingly precise determination of the consensually validatable properties of things, and for efficient utilization of precisely determined things as tools.
And that's in a sense where these two worlds come together, because the stage that we, within the yellow box here, the stage that we operate within, we appropriate objects as tools. Again, we see tools. And so science is in that sense nested within the being, as he calls it. And an example of that might be, again, nuclear weapons, because science affords it. Why do we build nuclear weapons? Because they are powerful tools. Why do we construct everything we do? Because they are powerful tools. So story governs stuff. When we see things, we see opportunities, we see possibilities. We therefore grab hold of this Newtonian materialistic world, and we take it and we run up and down hierarchies with this stuff. And this is how the world works.
Once the direction such use is to take has been determined through application of more fundamental narrative processes, no complete world picture can be generated without use of both modes of construal. The fact that one mode is generally set at odds with the other means only that the nature of their respective domains remains insufficiently discriminated.
Now, this is where he's getting, let me pull up the other drawing that this is in my previous videos when I talked about the revenge of the materialist. This is, in a sense, what the materialists do, is you have the argument with Sam Harris about the woman who kills herself because she believes her husband is having an affair. Well, there you go. No brain, no knowing. And this is where I got into my conversation of a monarchical vision, because in a sense, the materialists assume this monarchical vision in order to act on their revenge by outnesting Jordan Peterson's being. But now what Peterson is saying here is that the frontier between these two worlds is complicated, and this is, in a sense, what we're talking about. And it's further complicated because we see ourselves as constructed, evolved beings ourselves, who are subject to the processes that brought us into this moment in history. And this is some of what we're trying to sort out through going through C.S. Lewis's Miracles.
Adherents of the mythological worldview tend to regard the statements of their creeds as indistinguishable from empirical fact.
Now he's talking about fundamentalists. Now he's saying a lot of fundamentalists can't understand the difference between the layers. And so, as when I was talking about the Ron Dart video in the last the video I'm posting before this, my Monday vlog, a lot of fundamentalists, unlike medieval readers of Scripture, a lot of fundamentalists say only one level in Scripture and say it has to be literal, it has to be historical. Well, why do they do this? They do this because out of the Enlightenment, they do this because the reason I chuckle is because what this does is it brings us back here to the frames, because the reason that fundamentalists assert that only the literal or the materialist layer matters is because they have adopted exactly the same assumptions as the materialists. And that's where modernists and fundamentalists are a civil war. They believe the same things. And as Ron Dart, if you go back and watch the whole of his video, he makes the comment that Sam Harris and others are just as much literalists as the biblical literalists that they're fighting. And you can see that when, for example, I've made this in past videos, when Richard Dawkins goes on Justin Brierley's unbelievable podcast, Richard Dawkins doesn't have any problems with the rabbi and with the evangelical that he's talking to, because these are nice, sane people. They're not like the horrible fundamentalists in Kansas that want to get rid of evolution in the classroom and so on and so forth. And so what we see here in terms of this conflict is that the fundamentalists and the materialists are making exactly the same mistake. And Peterson is saying, see the frame.
Even though such statements were generally formulated long before the notion of objective reality emerged.
I wish the thing didn't pause here. Not didn't pause there, but the video didn't pause. And again, what he's saying here is that he recognizes that the Bible predates this entire fight. And in some conversations with some people, even if you say go back to the many medieval methods of interpreting scripture, they didn't have this dichotomy. The world wasn't split. Now you'd like to say, well, I'd like to go back before the world was split. Well, yeah, okay, maybe, but there's a whole package that goes along with that. And there's reasons why, in terms of the history of philosophy and the history of theology, why the world did split. There are reasons why the Protestant Reformation happened. Now, if you listen to Alan Jacobs' biography of C.S. Lewis, Alan Jacobs asserts that Lewis felt that the Reformation was a terrible error. Well, Lewis was a medievalist. Well, why was it a terrible error? Not that the issues that the church had to deal with in the Reformation were unimportant, because Lewis was an Anglican, he was not Roman Catholic, but that the church handled those issues so terribly poorly, and there has been great cost for that. Now, again, if you look at human history and just about anything, that's usually how we do it. If there's a way to do it poorly, we usually take that way. Fortunately, the Cold War didn't get as bad as it could have gotten. So, yay for us. But this is so Peterson's saying, this bifurcation of these two perspectives, we can look before the bifurcation into the medieval period, into the time in which the text was written. They didn't have this framework. Now we have the difficulty of, once you see something, you can't unsee it. And so once we know something, we can't unknow it. And so once we have this distinction, we have to live with it. But then how do we deal with texts that are before it? And if you're studying the Bible, one of the clearest places you have to deal with this is in the synoptic problem, where you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you have differences, discrepancies, conflicts between four canonical versions of the story of Jesus. And they get as alarming as, John disagreeing on, the day that Jesus is crucified. So, and then some people will come back to me, no, there's no disagreement. I mean, today we would rather take all four Gospels and make them one and say, this is the history. That would be the fundamentalistic approach. The church didn't do that. Well, why not? Well, they didn't want to. Well, why didn't they want to? Because they felt we were better with four. And you might say, yeah, but four doesn't help me with my project, with my fundamentalistic project of saying, this is the way it was. And just as in this one story. And in other words, it's like the kids who, the baseball broke the window in the house, and the kids all get together and get their story straight so they can have one story to tell the owner of the house but in getting their story straight, they're trying to manage the owner of the house. And so this is what's happening in terms of the Bible. And well, he's in his prolegomena with respect to the resurrection, because we have 4 plus 1 Corinthians 5 resurrection accounts. And actually the earliest one is 1 Corinthians.
Those who, by contrast, accept the scientific perspective, who assume that it is or might become complete, forget that an impassable gulf currently divides what is from what should be.
I'm not sure about that move right there. Is that is one way of framing the gulf. But, even as I've been working through this stuff, even framing the gulf accurately is not easy. And now the reason that we're running into this is because obviously everything runs downhill to the resurrection when it comes to Christianity. And the thing people want to pin Peterson on is, did Jesus come out of that grave or not? If there was a video camera, rolling, what would the camera see? And this is something that has gone on through. I have a friend who told me that when he had his classical examination, in order to be examined for a minister in my denomination, one of the questioners, I think somebody from the audience, asked him, did the serpent's lips move when the serpent was talking to Eve? We can't avoid this question because of what has happened before us. And as much as we would like to nuance this is exactly, in a sense, this is why people avoid the Bible. This is why people stay away from church. This is why fools rush in where angels dare not tread. I'm not saying Jordan Peterson is a fool. I think he's courageous, and I really appreciate that he's engaging these issues. But this is the dilemma, that we bottom line these things into here. And so that's why, even before we get to the resurrection, we're talking about history.
I wrote this a little later. It's also relevant as introduction to what we're going to discuss in a bit. The world can be validly construed as a forum for action, as well as a place of things.
There's the boxes again.
We describe the world as a place of things using the formal methods of science. The techniques of narrative, however, myth, literature, and drama, portray the world as a forum for action. The two forms of representation have been unnecessarily set at odds because we have not yet formed a clear picture of their respective domains. Okay.
He introduced the word representation, which is really important. And I found when I first started listening to Peterson, I immediately saw he's trying to put the world back together. And as a Christian pastor, we need that, because not trying to put the world back together is putting us exactly where we're at right now, where fundamentalists over here are doing creation science. And I'm not going to badmouth that discipline. I think, okay, we all begin from presuppositions. These are your presuppositions. Go to town. And I think, hey, see what you can learn. Usually ideas from another angle will yield different things. But that's the fundamentalist. And then you've got the materialists on the other side that's saying, this is all hogwash. I don't believe a thing of it. Oh, okay. There's, for a long time, people who are a little bit more fair in terms of rules of evidence, how to understand things, would say, hey, wait a minute. We have a lot of evidence for the fact that your materialist framework is probably not all there is. And that's why I taught that as a dogma, as the temple of materialism. And I want to do a little video on an outlier who is banging on the door of this temple. And Peterson is in a sense doing it, but Peterson's not quite the heretic as this other guy. I can't remember his last name. His first name's Rupert, and he'll show up in the comments, and someone will post a video. And I haven't figured out how to deal with that guy. But so Peterson, now when you introduce the word representation, in a sense we have the fight here, and you're saying, now wait a minute. When we introduce representation, we're adding perception to the conversation, and that's helpful, because both the fundamentalists and the materialists are saying we see this directly. And when you introduce representation, you begin to say, well, what's really competing are representations of a reality. And so now we've got one step removed. And this one step removed is helpful, because then maybe we can start to understand what we're doing. Now, I also started reading a biography of Dallas Willard, and some of you know that Dallas Willard has come up a few times in my conversations, and I wish he were alive. He would be an awfully interesting partner in this conversation with Jordan Peterson if he were alive, because Dallas Willard is a phenomenologist, and one of Dallas Willard's things is he wanted to argue that we have direct knowledge of things. And so adding representation here is an interesting move, because it's a helpful move, because then we can say, well, when you see a picture of the solar system, and I've walked through this in previous videos, when you see a picture of the solar system, you're actually drawing a representation, a phenomenological a truer phenomenological representation of the solar system doesn't look that different from the Genesis 1 representation of a flat earth and a dome and a firmament. A phenomenological representation of travel to the moon doesn't involve this globe here and this smaller globe here and this line that goes around and whips around there and goes to the moon. It involves the astronaut getting up in the morning and driving to the space center and getting in this capsule and going up in a rocket. And so your representation can't help but involve usually some kind of monarchical vision of the picture. And so this is why now in his second reading, you just read a little bit from Maps of Meaning. Now we're almost 20 years later. He added representation. I'm sure it was in Maps of Meaning, but he's recognizing we're trying to figure this out, and we're using tools to figure this stuff out.
The domain of the former, scientific domain, is the objective world, what is from the perspective of intersubjective perception. The domain of the latter,
intersubjective perception. Again, that's in a sense, if we're going to own up that we can't possibly ourselves possess this objective view or a monarchical vision, then the intersubjective. So the woman who commits suicide because she believes her husband is having an affair, it's the intersubjective because some other viewer comes around and looks at the situation and talks to the witnesses and tries to determine, was her husband having an affair or not? That's intersubjective. It takes more than one view. The monarchical vision assumes one objective view. And now the way that we work in order to try to approximate this one objective view, this monarchical vision of reality, is that we get witnesses and we take out the subjective. And again, we've been going through this in a number of our videos, but this is all within this language. And so what Peterson's doing here, especially in part 1 of this, and I'm probably going to have to chop it up into little parts, what Peterson is doing here is taking all of this stuff he's been doing and he's concentrating it down all the way into these few words. Now, that's really helpful if you've been following the story all along, but if you're a Christian who's jumping into this, say, I want to know what he means about the resurrection, and you're hearing this stuff, you're thinking, blah, 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 because as a pastor, let's take all of the stuff that we've learned from Jordan Peterson. Someone comes up to you and say, Pastor, I want to talk about the resurrection. Okay, what do you want to talk about? Did Jesus really come out of the grave? Okay. Why are you asking that question? Probably part of it is I want to define you. I want to put you in a box over here so I can know what kind of pastor you are, so I can pass judgment on if I go to your church, I go to someone else's church, either because you want to go to a church where a pastor says, yeah, he rose from the dead. You could touch him like this. Or you want to go to a church where the pastor says, no, this is a brilliant metaphor for new life and second chances and all of these things. So why are you asking the question? Well, as a pastor, I know people come to you and they say, did Jesus rise from the dead? Because part of what they want to know is, am I going to be reunited with my lost ones for whom death has destroyed the relationship? It's a very pragmatic question. And so that's what people have in their mind. And this then gets into the second issue with the resurrection that we're going to have to get into, that the resurrection in the Bible and in Christianity means a lot more than just, am I going to see my loved ones again? Because the rather Gnostic common view amongst many evangelicals and non-church-going and non-church-going Christians is that what the Bible says is that there's life after death and we go up to heaven to be with our loved ones, end of story. Now, someone who had seen my conversation with Jordan Peterson said you should have brought up N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope, where he talks about resurrection in that book. And it's a shorter book than his big book. And N.T. Wright goes into a lot of these things. And I couldn't think of everything. So, okay, if I have another conversation, I'll bring the book because it was a good idea. But this is the question. Again, and Peterson is right. We see tools. And so when we think about Jesus' resurrection, we want to appropriate it as a tool for something. And that's part of the reason why if someone feels themselves in the materialist, Newtonian, as Jordan Peterson calls it, box, that's where the resurrection lies. And so, well, this is a nice picture of Easter eggs and second chances and new beginnings. And, you know, I used to be on drugs and I'm not on drugs anymore. And I have a whole new life. And that's what the resurrection is about. And to that I say, not for most of Christian history. And then others say, well, the resurrection is about, am I going to see my beloved wife or daughter or father or mother again? And I'd say, well, you're getting closer. The resurrection is, we're getting in the general area, but the resurrection is about a whole lot more than that. The resurrection is about creation 2.0. The resurrection is about the renewal of heaven and earth, which is why when you get to the end of the book of Revelation, you have a renewed heavens and a renewed earth. Well, why a renewed heavens? Did that get messed up too? No, you're not understanding the way the story is working symbolically.
Drama and narrative is the world of value, what is and what should be, from the perspective of emotion and action. The world as a forum for action presents itself in two stories. The normal story, I was at point A and I was going to point B. And the revolutionary story, I was at point A and while going to point B, something entirely unexpected and earth-shattering happened.
Now, this is from, I believe it's from Maps of Meaning, his Maps of Meaning course. And again, if you want a longer view of this, watch his Maps of Meaning courses.
This meant I had to abandon my story, question my assumptions, allow my old beliefs to die, and be reborn anew.
Okay. Now, it's important that we're here in part one of him dealing with the resurrection, because this is, I think, in some ways, his psychological interpretation of the resurrection. Now, we're getting back to the motivation for people coming to me as a pastor and saying, Pastor Paul, when Jesus rose from the dead, did doubting Thomas really touch his hand? Did he feel those scars? And why is it important that Jesus eats a fish and they can't, like in some x-ray, they can't see it go down him or anything like that? Is the resurrection merely this? Now, I suspect, and I've listened to this video a couple of times now with Peterson's, Peterson does not want to be a reductionist. And that's important if you're going to be fair to him. He doesn't want to be a reductionist, but he's saying the resurrection story is this kind of story. And someone might say, oh, okay. But is that all the resurrection story is? And Peterson would want to say no. But you could come back on him and say, but there's lots of other stories like this. In fact, this is your paradigmatic order, chaos, hero's journey story. And so if, in a sense, you appropriate the resurrection as a hero's journey story, which on one level it is, by virtue of how we interact with stories, we tend to imagine, well, that's what this story is. And now Peterson will want to say, yeah, that's what this story is, but it's more. Well, part of the problem is when we hear that, especially with our filters, we stop and we say, well, that's all you're saying. Well, that's not all he's saying, but this is the danger of telling the story this way. And part of the difficulty we have with telling stories to people is that this is what always happens to people. And in a sense, the mirror opposite happens to fundamentalists, because when they tell the resurrection story, the only story they hear is a tribalistic story about, I only go to church with pastors who talk about a physical resurrection. Okay, fair enough. But is that all the resurrection story is? So this is why all this stuff is hard.
The second story, which is deeper, is essentially religious. Part 2.
Okay, I think I'm going to pause there. I'm 35 minutes in. Part 1 was 5 minutes, 30 minutes, 6 minutes of me talking for every 1 minute his talking. Probably not a good sign, but there it is. And as I've said before, no retakes. This is just this is live, baby. But yeah, I'll dive into more.